We're here today at the WA State Seminar, and we're talking to the CEC, which is the Citizens Electoral Council. They're a federal political party, and they're having a talk today about the looming economic crisis. I'm here today with Robbie Barwick. He's the CEC Research Director. And Robbie, tell us a little bit about today's event here for the CEC in Perth.
Well, this is our annual state seminar. We have a special guest, John Adams, who's come over from the East Coast with us. I'm from Melbourne. The theme today is that what are the policy solutions Australia must be implementing before there's an economic crash, because there is going to be an economic crash. And one of the things that we've spent here doing in the last few days is looking at the Perth property market. I think your Perth viewers would know the market's down quite a bit. Well, it is where Melbourne and Sydney are heading. And if what's happened in Perth was replicated across the rest of Australia now, we would have banks already in danger of failing right now. This is our concern. So we need to get policies in place before that happens. And we're a political party, the CEC, and the challenge is to get politicians to acknowledge there's a problem, because they don't want to do that. And in fact, all they're doing is coming up with ways to keep pushing up prices. But the prices of houses, if you keep pushing them up, attached to the prices is debt. And the debt is becoming unpayable. And that's what's going to cause the crisis. So that's what we're trying to address. Perth's had this problem started in 2014. The problem is growing on the East Coast. And what that means is that the banks, the Australian banks, the big four, which are the banks here as well as over there, are getting into more trouble. And where Perth is having difficulty is the Royal Commission forced the banks to raise their lending standards, and people in Perth, and the normal tricks that governments would employ to try and push up prices, requires the banks to do a lot of loose lending, and that's not happening. Now the government might try and find ways to do that, but in the meantime people are trapped in mortgages that they can't pay, and you got pockets of Perth like Mandurah, or Western Australia like Mandurah, which has the highest mortgage stress in Australia, in fact. There are whole streets there just full of for sale signs. And that is really extreme. You're getting to the point where that starts to trigger rapid price falls. So Perth, in 5 years, Perth's gone down about close to 20%. People here would be hoping, well, that's going to turn around soon and everything will be okay. Well, what if it doesn't? Right? Because when you see pockets where everyone's trying to sell at once, that doesn't help you turn around the market. That's going to push it down further. And if that spreads, Perth can be the first place to get to 30% down, 40% down, perhaps even more, right? And the East Coast will follow, and our banks will be in trouble.
So beyond the Perth property market, what's the other issue? Because the biggest elephant in the room is the Glass-Steagall, which is where banks are basically tied in together, and the talk today is about breaking that up, right?
Well, that's our policy. So because what Glass-Steagall does is it stops banks from being able to gamble. Banks have a lot of exotic ways they gamble with money. But if banks have deposits, which is our money, and that's our money they're gambling with. And banks, this should never have been allowed. And for nearly 70 years in America, before deregulation, they had a policy that said banks with deposits aren't allowed to have anything to do with investment banking where the gambling takes place. And that worked. It kept the banking system stable, right? And banks were boring, but you knew what they were for. It's because banks are lending so much on property in Australia because they get to gamble on those mortgages, like if you ever watch the movie The Big Short, etc. Right? So one of our policies, and our principal policy, in fact, our leading policy is let's break the banks up so they stop gambling. And then if they stop gambling, they can't do those kind of tricks. But you're going to have to, that doesn't solve the debt problem that's in the banks. We have to do other measures. We have to implement other measures to do that, right? But while there's a process of reorganisation of the banking system, the debt has to be written down in many respects, etc. And you'll have a period of transition afterwards. Things can go back to normal, but without the banks going back to their bad habits. It's bad behaviour that caused the property prices to go up as fast as they did and high as they did in the first place. Now those prices are going down. It's the banks that are in trouble. If the banks start failing, we're all in trouble.
Well, that's all we have time for. I'm Bas Tadros for Undercurrent.